honesty, rigor, and original perspectives. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean that we are blind to the human tragedy that is unfolding and the mass scale of killings. I know for a fact that some people in our audience have lost family either in Gaza or during the 7th of October. So during the Q&A session, regardless of everybody's political stances, I ask our audience to be respectful to our guests, of course, and also to people whose lives are actually being destroyed and who might be listening right now and for whom this isn't just an intellectual conversation. So today's topic is on the roles played by honor or dignity in the shaping of behaviors, affects, or mobilizations related to Israel and Palestine. Indeed, moral imperatives such as justice or injustice, order, or survival are frequently invoked to comprehend either national movements or their broader support networks. And at the same time, the notion of honor or dignity we felt does not receive as much scrutiny, yet we believe it plays a crucial, even if maybe underestimated role in shaping perceptions of Israel-Palestine and behaviors on the ground. So to tell us more about this, our first guest is Mohammed Bamyeh, a Palestinian-American sociologist. He is currently a professor of sociology at the University of Pittsburgh, a former chair of the board of the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, and a former editor of the International Sociology Reviews. He taught in several universities in the USA and has held invited lectures around the world. He is the author or editor of 12 books in such areas as the sociology of knowledge, social movements and revolutions, Islamic studies, and autonomous political life. Parts of his works have been translated into Arabic, Turkish, German, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and other languages. Our other guest is Derek Penslar. He's a professor of Jewish history at Harvard University. He's also one of the most prolific historians of Zionism. Penslar's originality lies in part in the uniqueness of the themes he addresses. He has worked on the history of science and technology in Zionism and Technocracy, on economic history in Shylock's Children, Economics and Jewish Identity in Modern Europe, and military history in Jews and the Military History. He's also the author of a biography of Theodor Herzl, published in 2020, and has recently published a book on the emotional history of Zionism called Zionism: An Emotional State. Professor Penslar has also edited books and contributed chapters on the sensitive theme of post-colonial theory's relationship with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or situation or whatever. Such as Orientalism and the Jews, in Colonialism and the Jews, and more recently, Unacknowledged Kinships, Post-Colonial Theory and the Historiography of Zionism, published in 2023. Finally, he co-directs the Task Force on Anti-Semitism established by Harvard University. So before we begin, a final point on how we will function today and in the next discussions. Our two guests will be asked a series of similar questions for an hour, and then we will open the chat for Q&A with the audience for the last 20 minutes. Valentina will be selecting your questions, your respectful questions, and then we will ask them to our guests. There's a Q&A section in the chat, so be careful to ask your questions in there. So that being said, thank you very much. Welcome to our guests, and we will start with the first question, which is going to be very quick, just 2 minutes each. Can you please provide us with the working definition of dignity or honor that you will be using for this discussion? Maybe Professor Bamyeh can start.
Thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to the engagement with this audience very much. The concept is great, actually, because it's central to the conflict in many ways that I think we can talk about later. For me, the dignity is a claim that people make to refer to having a right to equality. That in equality in humanity, that is not equality in necessarily in socioeconomic terms, but equality in terms of being treated as equal human subjects. I think it does have actually modern history. It does also include other dimensions, I think, because it refers to conditions of a struggle where there is an absence of tricks. That is, even when it does not, so dignity does not mean sometimes it is used to as a language to regulate conflict and to make it kind of appear to be, so to speak, according to rules that everyone kind of respects, and thereby they prove their humanity to each other in the middle of the conflict, as one would say, for example, in what we sometimes call traditional feuds that have their own kind of norms that I have studied, and those norms are basically kind of are intended to actually convey to everyone who is actually watching the conflict that this is really something that is respectful, dignified, being done according to rules that are agreeable, and is far from barbarism. Another dimension of dignity that I think is important to keep in mind is that it is central to modern philosophies, especially Hegel, kind of understanding of the logic of recognition, Axel Honneth building on that as well. And I think a lot of the colonial and anti-colonial struggles basically kind of really are central to kind of this idea of recognition of equality, basically as being kind of the presumed kind of end of conditions of domination, colonialism, and unjust conflict. I think that was 2 minutes. That's...
Thank you very much. Professor Penslar?
Well, the term dignity, like the word digne in French, refers to something being worthy. And the German Selbstwürde, I think, also nicely captures the sense of dignity, self-worth, the notion that you as a human being have value, that other people respect you, and to confirm what you were saying, that they recognize you, Anerkennung, that they recognize you. It's not necessarily equality, though. I think that's a 20th century anachronism. I mean, in all kinds of traditional societies, there are highly developed concepts of honor. In a medieval caste society, for example, or a state-based society, these societies centered around the concept of honor, but they were not equal. I think there's actually not a very strong correlation between honor or dignity on the honor, for sure, and equality. Dignity is perhaps more of a 20th century concept, and more associated with equality, which is interesting. People talk about societies of honor being replaced by societies based on dignity, although I think the two terms are quite similar. Honor, then, is a sense of being true to oneself, of respecting oneself. It is the opposite of shame. Shame is a sense that you as an individual have performed in ways that society looks down upon, and you think badly of yourself as a result. Shame is a disempowering emotion, whereas honor is an empowering emotion. And honor and dignity are absolutely central to national liberation movements long before the era of anti-colonial movements. The national liberation movements of the 18th and 19th century, for example, within what is often, I think, misidentified as the colonial world, given that huge swaths of the Western world did not engage in overseas colonialism. But the concept of oppressed peoples, Czechs, Poles, Ukrainians, Italians, Greeks, they all used the language of honor and dignity. And that particularly honor in that language spread then in the later 19th century and 20th century throughout the world in anti-colonialism. So I think honor is actually a very ancient concept. Dignity perhaps a somewhat more modern one. But what they share in common is the sense of self-worth and respect, self-respect and respect by others.
Thank you very much for your answer, Professor Penslar. So now we can move on to the second question, which we'll try to do it for 10 minutes each. So we can continue directly with you, Professor Penslar, and then we'll switch the order. In your opinion, what historical role has been played by ideas of Jewish honor or Jewish dignity in the emergence of the Zionist movement? And we have 10 minutes, more or less.
Well, first of all, I want to say hi to Salwan Kamuk. If it's the same Salwan Kamuk who studied with me in Munich last year.
He's the same. Hi, Professor.
Hi, Salwan. Wie geht's dir? How are you? It's great to...
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you. It's nice to hear from you, to hear you again.
Well, very nice. That was a wonderful, we were in Munich together. I taught a seminar on the 1948 war at LMU last year, and Solon was in the class. The funny thing about the Zionist project is that it can't be understood without going back at least a century to the Jewish intellectual and cultural movement known as the Haskalah. The Haskalah, or the Jewish version or variant of the European Enlightenment. Because although the Haskalah was largely a literary movement and a cultural movement, it was also very much an aesthetic movement, and one about the education of the senses, or the training of the emotions. And so central to the whole Jewish encounter with modernity, and not only in the Western world, to a lesser extent in the Middle East, has been a desire for honor, for respect, because as Jews become more integrated into the society that surrounds them, no longer existing as a separate corporation, but having both the opportunity and the desire to integrate into that outside society, they want to be respected. They want to be recognized. And so much of the ideology of the Haskalah was about Jews being respectable, the German term salonfähig. And I don't know what the French, I guess just respectability would be the English term. And by the way, you should all, I speak French, I just speak French poorly. So if you want to ask questions in French, I'll understand you. So there's actually very little in Zionism in a sort of even the idea of territory is not necessarily present in the earlier forms of Zionism. When you think of when Natan Birnbaum, for example, invented the word Zionism in the early 1890s, it was really another way of saying Jewish nationhood or Jewish nationalism, a celebration of Jews as a nation. And again, the concept of honor and dignity, whether it's the Haskalah's desire to integrate the Jewish individual into society as an honorable, salonfähig individual, or it's the Jewish nationalist desire to integrate the Jewish nation into the community of nations worldwide, the fundamental emotional underpinning is the search for honor. So you really cannot separate Zionism from the Haskalah, although Zionism claims to be the Haskalah's opponent, because Zionism is about a collective of Jews and Haskalah is about the Jews as individuals, but actually they're very closely related. When you look at the writings of the very early Zionists, who, by the way, weren't called Zionists, the very first Zionists were called lovers of Zion, mobilizations or Zion, love of Zion. You see in the very first writings an emphasis on honor. So, for example, Lev or Leon or Leo Pinsker, an eye doctor from Odessa who wrote an important pamphlet called Self-Emancipation in the early 1880s, he writes quite clearly that the Jews must have a sense of honor, respect, and acceptance in the international community. He's not a Zionist in the later sense of the word. He's not talking about a Jewish state in the land of Israel, in historic Palestine. He wants the Jews to have a political essence, an entity somewhere in the world where they can be safe, to be sure, but also where they can be honored, where they can be respected, where they can have dignity, although he uses the term Selbstwerde, he uses the term Ehre, honor. He doesn't use the term dignity per se. And this emphasis on honor and respect was repeated in a much less well-known pamphlet written a year later by an Orthodox Jewish rabbi who was a leader of the mobilizations, who was the chief rabbi of Menel in the Baltic in Germany. And this man named Rolf, Isaac Rolf, wrote a pamphlet called Comfort Ye My People. It's not Comfort Ye My People, it's from the book of Jeremiah. And it's a pamphlet about mercy to the people of Israel, or mercy coming to the people of Israel, in which he says, if the Gentiles cannot love us, let them respect us. We will be members of the international community. We will be respected. And I'm emphasizing this because if it's really a mistake to misread the early history of Zionism in terms of fear for Jewish lives. If all people cared about was saving Jewish lives, they would have just gone and done what most Jews did in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They would have gone to North America, or to a lesser extent, South America, Western Europe, and South Africa. But the Zionist project was about more than just fleeing for safety. It was about honor, respect, and becoming part of an international community. And you see this through the whole history of the Zionist project, whether it's the speeches of Theodor Herzl or of Chaim Weizmann, the Zionist leaders of the interwar period and beyond, that the idea of Zionism, it is to create a Jewish national home, a functioning Jewish national economy. And I understand that for the victims of Zionism, the concept of Jewish honor might seem a bit far-fetched. But Jews had been, in Europe, a people essentially consigned to being without honor. And the Jews of Russia, the Jews of Poland, the Jews of Germany, that they were not even considered worthy of consideration for honor. The notion that, for example, Jews who joined student organizations in Central Europe in the late 19th century were not considered to be worthy of dueling. There was a very common practice, which is still practiced, by the way, today in some German universities, where young people duel with each other. But you have to be what's called worthy of dueling, satisfaktionsfähig. Jews were not considered satisfaktionsfähig. So this emphasis on honor, collective and individual, is inseparable, and it is simply baked into the Zionist project from the time of Herzl, Isaac Rolf, Pinsker, through the 1920s, 1930s, and beyond. And so much of the propaganda literature that was disseminated to the world in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s about the achievements of the Yishuv, the Jewish national home, was about Jews becoming productive laborers, Jews producing for themselves and not depending on the work of others. In other words, being independent beings who are honorable. And if they are honorable, they have an internal sense of honor. They are honored by others or respected by others, and they have self-respect. This was absolutely essential. The combination then of wanting to be a nation like all nations, of wanting to be respected, honored, and accepted, really reached its culmination in the Declaration of the Establishment of the State, which is often incorrectly called the Declaration of Independence. That's not what it was called, because there was nothing to be independent from. It was a declaration of the establishment of the state, in which there are several references to the international community, that Israel will be a state among other states, the Jews will be a people like all peoples, and that herein lies the essence of honor, dignity, respect, and acceptance. I'm just going to finish by saying that however peculiar and however unique the Zionist case may be, that notion of honor, respect, that craving was so common among anti-colonial movements of the first half of the 20th century. There's a very good book about India and Ireland that shows how both Indian nationalism of the first half of the 20th century and Irish anti-British nationalism is steeped in notions of the loss of masculinity, because there's a very heavily gendered notion in concepts of honor. It's not about feminine honor, it's about masculine honor, strength, vigor, power. It's not a mistake, by the way, that Vivekananda, who was a very important figure in Indian spirituality in the early 20th century, spoke a lot about virility and manhood and the virtues of eating meat, right? That Indian nationalism had its own masculine drive for honor. And although it's unfair today, Vivekananda is often seen as a spiritual heir of Hindutva, that is the extreme Indian nationalism. It's not fair to Vivekananda. The point is that the Zionists are not alone. The sense of emasculation, the sense of the loss of dignity, the desire for honor as a collective, this is something that the Zionist project had in common with a great many other national and anti-colonial movements of the modern period. With that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Professor Penslar. So, Professor Bamyeh, I'm going to ask you a similar question, but you can also rebound and comment what has just been said. So, in your opinion, what historical role has been played by ideas of dignity in the Palestinian national movement?
I think in some ways, actually, we may have the reverse the equation to the history that Dr. Penslar just mentioned. The arrival at honor of one community is also kind of the suffering of dishonor on the other side. perhaps. But basically, going back to the earlier point I made about colonial kind of conditions globally, including in Europe as well. I think the language of dignity basically is central to the history of Palestinian national struggle, as it is central to the anti-colonial struggles everywhere else, really, ultimately. One, of course, kind of outcome of that is nationalism itself, basically as a framework by which people claim equality, right? That is, colonized people kind of claim equality to those who are colonizing them, who also define themselves as nations, so to speak, right? And so the spread, I think the global spread of nationalism, basically as an idea, is related to this perception, right? That those societies that have developed a colonial mindset earlier also became global empires earlier and were able to dominate others, and your responding kind. And this is something that I think Eric Hobsbawm kind of describes very well, kind of in the history of colonialism, anti-colonialism, and how basically these ideas about collective identity and rights basically kind of get disseminate basically and get applied everywhere, including places where the conditions are not yet ripe for national consciousness. The emergence of Palestinian national consciousness is really part of the story, this story as well. That is basically we are made basically into the national entity that we are precisely because we have suffered the common fate, and essentially on the hands basically of another community that defined itself as a nation. Now, more specific to the Palestinian case is the becoming refugees, basically. That's actually a really important story. Another thing is the creation of a Palestinian diaspora after 1948, a global Palestinian diaspora. Now, in much of Palestinian national consciousness, the diaspora, as shatat, basically, is considered to be, or rather is seen as a tragedy. Not necessarily because diaspora is always a tragic condition by itself, rather, but because the specific conditions of the Palestinian diaspora basically included some, I think, 4 elements really that are somewhat kind of unique in combination with each other, the Palestinian case. One of them is that their diaspora is unchosen. That is, it is forced upon that population by another force. The other kind of aspect of the diaspora in modern Palestinian national consciousness is that it is accidental. That is, this is not simply a simple migration, although we do that, but essentially it is actually kind of it is kind of an outcome of what is seen to be a conspiracy against them, not just by the Zionist movement, but also by the colonial West in general, basically against the Palestinian people. A third kind of vision of the Palestinian diaspora or shatat is that it is temporary. And that, of course, goes with the other kind of understandings of the diaspora, basically, as being unchosen and accidental, that things that are unchosen and accidental are also supposed to be temporary, right, in nature. And at some point, that we will cease to be a diasporic people. How? We, of course, that's the question that we always have in front of us. And finally, related to all of the above, the diaspora condition for the Palestinians is unjust. So part basically of the mindset that we are talking about here kind of addresses the questions of diaspora, basically as a condition of indignity, to speak, for the 4 kind of properties of this diaspora that I just mentioned. And now one thing, in addition to that, we have the refugee population, obviously. And becoming a refugee, of course, is obviously a condition of indignity and was so understood by the Palestinian people. Not just because it is actually a forced condition, but also because it's a condition of being abandoned by everybody else, basically, in the process. So the question is, what do you do with the kind of a new reality that was created for Palestinians after 1948? One of the things that you begin to see in the Palestinian refugee camps from 1948 until the late 60s in particular is how a traditional traditional Palestinian village culture is actually revived in the refugee camps by former peasants and who use kind of that culture that is familiar to them to organize life in the refugee camps. And that is important because in the refugee camps, these are all supposed to be temporary. These are not permanent settlements. There are no property rights. This becomes because they're temporary. This becomes an issue after a couple generations where the refugee camp population is growing. You need to build, but you don't have building permits. How do you organize who owns what, papers, and how do you actually make sure that no one actually kind of impose themselves too much on their neighbors? All those regulations of everyday life, right, kind of are organized according to traditional rules that were familiar to Palestinian peasants who had become refugees in the process. And the Palestinian village basically is kind of reproduced in the village camp. So that traditional culture basically essentially, and it is kind of re-invoking it in the refugee camp, it really becomes a way by which kind of Palestinians kind of restore some dignity to their life collectively, and not because any state has helped them, but through re-invoking patterns of their own culture. And this is really an important thing to understand how, in a way, a traditional culture, so to speak, kind of becomes more important in the diaspora for Palestinians, right? And especially in the refugee camp in particular. You also see outside the refugee camp from especially 1967 until 1982, the establishment of a global Palestinian civil society, ultimately. And that is also important in the sense because it is one way by which to make the diaspora condition that had been and continues to be kind of understood as a tragedy for the reasons I mentioned, that is ameliorated a little bit by the creation of these global networks of general unions, basically, that eventually all of which fold into the PLO at some point as kind of a Palestinian civil society organizing itself in the diaspora. By the late 60s, in particular, in the refugee camps in particular, you have another culture that is actually born there. In addition to the traditional village culture, we have a revolutionary culture, basically, that emerged of a new type, basically. And that is important, that actually becomes important after 1967 in particular, when it becomes obvious to Palestinians that they have to rely on themselves and that they cannot rely on Arab governments. Hence, the emergence of the modern Palestinian resistance movement. It is born in the refugee camp. It does not follow the patterns of traditional village life. It is actually a new type of culture. It is more meritocratic. It is actually organized across refugee camps, right? And it allows for things, for example, like individuals who do not belong to the Ayan, these kind of established families to become leaders, to speak. And these two cultures live side by side, the traditional kind of village culture and the modern revolutionary cultures, to speak right. So that are ways by which I think kind of these two cultures kind of help kind of restore to Palestinian a sense not just of kind of capacity for survival, so to speak, under difficult condition, but also a sense of agency, that we are able to actually rely on ourselves by ourselves, right? We have capacity, so to speak, even though we have no resources, to speak up. And the role, of course, of that revolutionary culture basically is in overcoming the feelings of indignity and humiliation is extremely important and lives on until today, ultimately. At least it lives very well until the Oslo Agreement. And then there are spurts where kind of it comes back to the fore, including today. and we can get back to what is happening today, perhaps later on. So self-reliance, basically in the political field, that becomes important. Self-reliance and the capacity to establish civil society, self-reliance and the capacity for continuing national consciousness and demand for rights across generations, into 4 generations in diaspora and so on. This also applies to Gaza today. So the stories I hear about Gaza today, especially the huge refugee kind of population in Rafah right now, kind of indicate how important the concept of dignity is in their life. Not just the lack of availability of food and water and sanitation and healthcare and all that, but kind of the kind of people talk a lot about, for example, not having kind of sufficient access to things like bathrooms, for example, things that we from the outside may think of as luxuries that people in war conditions or kind of who are facing the specter of onslaught and genocide may not be worried about. But indeed, in fact, I mean, collecting as much as possible stories from everyday life and how people are living in Gaza today, and often the daily encounter that they have with each other, the conversation that they have, the things they complain about, kind of illustrate how kind of part of the issue that they are dealing with is a condition of indignity, and not just material suffering, but rather kind of the feeling that the ongoing war basically is about not just defeating Hamas, but actually humiliating the Palestinians, putting them back in their place, putting them back to where they were before October 7th, teaching them a lesson without, of course, any political plan for afterwards. So the idea is that you had nothing before, right, this war, and you thought that you had some capacity that in October 7th, and we're going to teach you that you don't have that, and you have to be back in your place. So the consciousness that of the humiliation, dignity, honor, dishonor, being really a central kind of part of the emotional calculus of this entire history, right, from 1948 until today, is central and is visible in Gaza today as well, right? And not just the material suffering. I can say more, of course, about these issues perhaps later on when we get to the contemporary condition.
Thank you very much, Professor Bamyeh. And this is a good transition to the following question, which was specifically about the contemporary conditions, as you said. So I automatically follow up to a question to Professor Penslar. In your opinion, in comparison to other more imperatives, does honor or dignity play a role in contemporary forms of Israeli nationalism, or in the wider Israeli and/or /Jewish world and/or /Zionist world as a whole? And you can also rebound on what was just said. Thank you very much.
Right. You know, it's very interesting just now that Professor Bamyeh's comments focused on events since 1948. Mine focused on events up to 1948, and that's not a coincidence, because up to 1948, the Zionists were trying to create a state, and they experienced, if not in Palestine, somewhat in Palestine, but certainly in Europe and the Middle East, they experienced humiliation, indignity, dishonor, in various forms of persecution, in obviously Central and Eastern Europe, also in much of the Middle East, persecution of Jews in the Middle East in the 1930s and the 1940s, and then even persecution by the British in 1946, early 1947. And then Israel becomes a state. And once it becomes a state, concepts of honor and dignity still exist, but they are rooted in, and here's the really interesting historical difference from what we were just hearing from Professor Bamyeh, they're rooted in concepts of memory of indignity, dishonor, persecution, and most important, shame. Something we really have to heighten now. is that although Israel becomes a state after 1948, it has an army of which it's very proud. And to get back to the notion of agency, the revolutionary fighter, the Palestinian fighter, has their equivalent in the Haganah fighter or the Palmach fighter of the pre-1948 period, again, restoring honor to the Jewish people. Well, after 1948, you'd think that Israel can get past all that. It has a state, it has an army, it's very proud of the IDF, the Israel Defense Force. It fights against Egypt and Palestinian Fedayeen in 1956. It defeats them. It defeats, Egypt and Syria and Jordan in 1967. It holds back Arab state attacks on the occupied territories in 1973. One would think that Israel now had achieved the honor or the sense of dignity and security that it so much longed for, but that really hasn't been the case. Because what happened is the historical memory of the Holocaust, 3 generations later now in our own era, continues to weigh very heavily on Israelis. The sense of abandonment. I mean, Israel has not been abandoned by the world in the 21st century. The United States is a close ally of Israel that provides it diplomatic and military support. Much of the Western world has supported Israel in one form or another, and yet there's a very powerful idea in Israeli political culture that the country goes it alone, that it's been abandoned, even if empirically that's not true. And where does this come from? Is it just a fantasy with no grounds? It really comes from an unresolved trauma. So if we're going to talk about honor and dignity, we really have to bring in concepts of shame and trauma, because Israel is still grappling with the trauma and the shame from the Holocaust, the trauma of the evisceration of the Jewish people in Europe, the trauma of the circumstances of Israel's creation, and a sense of shame that Israel or the Zionist movement was not able to prevent the Holocaust, or as I've written somewhere, that no matter how strong the state of Israel is today, they cannot retroactively prevent the Holocaust. The Holocaust will always have been there. It will always be there. And so it's a metaphor that can be immediately brought to mind, not only for cynical and manipulative reasons, but even for sincere reasons, that people feel that the Holocaust is just around the corner. Whether it was on the eve of the 1967 war, or the eve of the 1982 war, when Menachem Begin, the prime minister, said the only alternative to invading Lebanon is Treblinka, right? This ongoing tension where, I guess it was in 2000, I guess it was 17, where Benjamin Netanyahu claimed that Mohammed Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, actually gave Hitler the idea for the Holocaust. I mean, this is not true. It's nonsense. But the ongoing sense of trauma and shame has, I think, pervaded Israeli political culture despite the military strength of the country, despite its economic success. So in a way, the Palestinians and the Israelis are in completely opposite camps. The Palestinians are, as we've heard, people of refugees, a people in dispersion, people who've been dispossessed. Israel is one of the wealthier countries in the world. It's a member of the OECD. It has a strong army. One reason why October 6th had the traumatic effect that it did in Israel, I mean, it was in and of itself, of course, a horrific tragedy, but it brought to mind immediately, and this is not a matter of manipulation, it really brought to mind immediately for Jews all over the world, including in Israel, this trauma from the Holocaust and from earlier forms of persecution, but particularly 1939 to 1945. So it's interesting how rarely the term honor, kavod, has really appeared in Israeli public discourse in recent years. People talk about the defense of the nation, they talk about the need to secure the nation, they don't talk about kavod, honor, whereas kavod was a very important concept in Zionist thinking before 1948, and maybe with the transition period of the 1950s and the 1960s, with, especially among diaspora Jews, admiration for the Israeli soldier as embodying, again, strength, masculine vigor, courage, and so forth. But I actually think the concept of honor as such and dignity as such has receded quite a bit in Israeli political thought, certainly since the 1960s. But what has survived are ongoing, either subterranean or quite visible senses of trauma, and an ongoing sense, again, of alienation from the international community, a sense of abandonment, a sense of being on the verge of catastrophe, constant, imminent catastrophe. And then October 7th happens. And October 7th seems to confirm the Cassandra-like predictions that Israelis have kept in the back of their mind for decades, that no matter how strong the state is, it is vulnerable. And then the feelings of anger and shame. There's a lot of shame. How could Hamas have done this to us? How could the Palestinians, who, as Professor Bamyeh said, what was the phrase that Raphael Eitan had said back in the early 1980s, that the Palestinians are like jukim masumamim b'bakbuk, like drugged cockroaches in a bottle. Oh, look what those drugged cockroaches did, right? So there's a sense of anger, frustration, humiliation. How did Hamas do this? How could they do this? So again, I think the sense of honor has declined, but the sense of indignity, humiliation, which, by the way, in Hebrew, hashpalah means bringing low, bringing somebody down, erniedrigung in German. That concept of having been brought low, the fear of being brought low. So it's very different in practice between the case of the Palestinians, as we've heard, and the case of Israel. Very different in practice, day and night, in fact. And yet, psychologically, there's some very interesting parallels.
Thank you very much, Professor Penslar. So, Professor Bamyeh, we can continue the exploration of the role played by dignity in contemporary Palestinian politics, and you can also respond to Professor Penslar's remarks.
Thank you. I should probably mention that earlier, but I do make a distinction between honor and dignity. Honor, basically, as Professor Penslar said earlier, it tends to be traditionally understood in masculinist terms, whereas dignity, actually, especially as it is being used today, among Palestinians as well as in the Arab uprisings since 2011, which is very prominent, the concept of dignity, karama, basically is there, has no specific gender connotation to it, in fact, and it is more kind of broader in terms, and it is irrelevant, basically what, to what we're talking about. But the way it is expressed varies, of course. I'd like to just mention some, I guess, gruesome examples, not because they are nice, but because they illustrate the point. If we think about October 7th, what happened there, or earlier forms of resistance, and I'm calling them resistance, just bear with me for a second, like suicide bombing, for example, during the second Intifada, right? And so on. Right? And the question is, why does this happen? Right? In the sense that, why does the weak attack the strong? Right? Knowing full well the consequences. Right? So obviously Hamas was not expected, they knew exactly what they're going to get after October 7th. Right? And suicide bombings earlier did not really have any clear kind of a strategy of liberation behind them either. And for me, actually, that was always a question as to, of course, I have also studied messianic movements in the anti-colonial kind of era as well in other parts of the world, and one sees similar kind of forms of resistance that often gruesome. But underlying that is also what appears to be a lack of plan, or apparent lack of plan, apparent actually lack of strategic resource, and full knowledge that you are going to be crushed after that. And that in itself actually is interesting, that it does have the kind of, these are things not that can be partially explained basically in terms of political strategy, but really can be understood also. They do have often public appeal, precisely because basically these are the situation in which basically the subaltern kind of, if you are calling that, kind of prove that they are there, demonstrate their dignity in their own way, that we are still here, that we are present, right? Even though you are ignoring us, right? And here is the evidence that we are there. We're going to cause you trouble, and we're going to cause you to actually react to ourselves, and then the cycle repeats itself, right, in a few years and so on. Right? So what appears to be kind of actual resistance, right, or pointless attacks, so to speak, right, or what appears to be gratuitous, basically acts of violence, is partially, basically, in a way, they do have a propaganda appeal, but that propaganda appeal also works, as a thing, because the people who are watching that, right, the Palestinians in particular in this case, do want to see agency, do want to see capacity. They want to see their ability to hurt their oppressor. And that for them verifies to them that they are still there and they're capable of acting. And I think often, basically, when you look at other histories in the colonial period, slave revolts and so on, that appears to be without a hope. You see, I think, a similar kind of dynamic at what we have seen, that we see in this case. So in a way, basically, we have acts that are not necessarily kind of connected to a clear strategic outlook, as to demonstrate again a long-standing claim, a right to self-determination, a right to be treated as equal in terms of the human kind of characters. Of course, the problem, of course, mainstream Israeli society is not willing to grant basically that recognition of equality. We just heard that from Professor Penslar, and that there's not preparedness for that, so to speak. Right? So that cycle we have seen before has continued. The other thing is that I'm not just talking about violence, but rather, for example, non-violent movement as well, which also do not appear to be highly promising, or rather are born from bleak conditions. For example, the first Intifada in 1987, it happened at a point in time when the Palestinian resistance movement was its weakest point, to speak, or at a low point rather. The PLO was in Tunisia in exile, was largely ineffective at that point. The Arab world was busy with the Iran-Iraq war, right? And the Arab Summit that happened that year completely ignored Palestine. And precisely at that low point in Palestinian history, you have the first Intifada coming, right, as basically an unorganized movement, ultimately, right, and a movement that did not really have a clear kind of a strategic a blueprint behind it. Emerges at that point, basically, as a collective expression, basically, of a right to dignity, ultimately. By the way, the same applies to after 67, which also when the real kind of mobilization of the Palestinians out of the refugee camp happened. That was also a low point, by the way. That is after 1967, and basically that's and it seemed that all the Arab states that formally at least adopted the Palestinian cause have been defeated ultimately. And precisely at that point of defeat, you have the modern kind of Palestinian resistance movement emerging out of conditions of hopelessness and weakness. So, and that you see it, that pattern you see throughout the Palestinian kind of resistance movement is kind of a condition of being at a low point, a hopeless condition. The world ignores Palestine, including the Arab world, by the way. And before October 7th, you had this so-called Abrahamic Accords, which were happening basically, in which the Palestinians absolutely have no role at all, and they were designed to bypass them. And precisely at that point, you have the more recent confrontation that we're having that put Palestine back on the map. So if you look at the various cycles of modern Palestinian resistance movement, you see kind of acts of resistance in various forms emerging precisely out of conditions of utter hopelessness, so to speak, right? And in each case, when that happens, you have this feeling of empowerment, right? A feeling of capacity, not feeling that we have won, of course, because that hasn't happened. But basically that we have the capacity to actually annoy a kind of our oppressors, basically, right? And live on another day, until basically we figure out what to do next. But it is not really the kind of study that is based on realism, ultimately, right? And that is also important, I think, here, because one of the equations that you see, I think, in modern Palestinian consciousness is a kind of somewhat lack of interest in realism, ultimately, right? Because realism as a perspective is unhelpful, right? For people who have their cards stacked against them, right? So other things become important, kind of acts that prove the capacity of the people who are weak otherwise, feeling strength out of their act, and feeling that they are present. They are here on the map. Now, I want to just say a few words about the Arab uprisings, ultimately, more generally beyond Palestine, because actually the picture is broader than Palestine in this case, because in 2011, in the Arab uprisings, all of them, the concept of karama, dignity, is paramount. And they have been basically some, and if you look at pre-revolutionary literature, also you see that's the opposition literature in Egypt and so on, it's like that. That's also in the novels written just before 2011. The concept of dignity is really very important. And the whole like Jacobian building, for example, from Egypt, where basically essentially the resolution, that was a bestseller, by the way, in Egypt before the revolution. And basically the solution is where at the end of the story, where essentially the peasant woman basically is recognized by the old aristocrat from the era of the monarchy, and somehow basically this recognition between the master and the slave, so to speak, kind of gives shape to a new society that is filled with justice. That was the imagination, I think, that you see everywhere in the Arab world, basically before 2011, as kind of a shape of how society should be, a just society would be after those revolutions. So in this sense, I think the Palestinian case is the kind of a variation on that, because because while kind of the Palestinians kind of live under occupation or as refugees, basically, right? And have obviously reason to complain about that. The Arab people in general also live under dictatorship that deny them dignity and rights as well. Right? So in both cases, you have this kind of the language of dignity ultimately comes to the fore to express sentiments across the region. Right? And these sentiments is that the regimes that govern us and the states of the regions, all of them, all the states of the region are unjust, right? Basically, right? And need to be overthrown, right? In some way or in one way or another. What comes after that, I don't think that is actually as clear. Now, finally, around that, there are a few works that have been written about kind of dignity, ethnographic kind of studies of the use of the word dignity in the Arab uprisings. One by Zainab Barnoussi, for example, who kind of did interviews and asked people, what do we mean by dignity when we were demonstrating in the streets, basically. And she found that whereas the dignity as a term is broadly used, when you actually ask people, what do you mean by that? They mention a whole range of issues. They include, for example, human rights. We are aware, basically, there is some document that says that there are human rights from 1948, so to speak, right? We don't know the content of it, but we know that we have them, that speaks somehow. There's also, for other people, the question of dignity refers to what they call social justice in general, right? Not just kind of justice to the person, but also to the throughout society as well. For others, dignity is related to material conditions, that improve material conditions that really brings dignity to everyday life, the speak that they have. And for the more religiously oriented people, dignity is an endowment by God. That the speak that kind of God kind of created the human and endowed them with dignity, and it is the obligation of the human that to defend God's endowment. This is, of course, a modern interpretation of religion. Of course, this is not universal, but at least kind of the idea of God in revolutionary situations becomes basically instrumentalized in a revolutionary direction.
Thank you very much, Professor Bamyeh. So we'll continue with the last question before we open the room to the Q&A from the audience. And I recall to our audience that they can ask questions in the Q&A section below. So only giving approximately 5 minutes each to your answers. Now, we talked about the past, we talked about the present. Now, let's talk about the future. What risks or advantages do you see in including this question of honor or dignity in eventual intellectual frameworks that can be used to search for solutions to the broader Israeli-Palestinian question? And maybe Professor Penslar, you can.
Well, I was thinking that having lived in Israel as I have since the 1970s and having lived through lots of wars and lots of Palestinian terror attacks, and I'm thinking about the reactions in Israel to these attacks. I mean, obviously anger, fear, hatred, but very rarely the language of indignity. As I said earlier, that language seems to have declined precisely because Israel is a state and has means of defending itself, and there's a great deal of pride in that state. But what changed, I think, was October 7th really changed things. This was different. It was not just different in scale or quantity. It was also qualitatively different. Because of its savagery and barbarism, because of the killing of families and the sexual violence against women and so forth, it was truly humiliating. It was an act of, again, of the robbing of dignity and the removal of a sense of invulnerability. So I think October 7th has changed things. And what it shows is the reaction of people who feel that their dignity has been stripped from them. They fall into a rage. And I think that Israel has been in a state of rage since October 7th. And Professor Bamyeh spoke about the suicide bombers or the terrorists or the people who do things that are not necessarily rational, but they're doing it because they're trying to assert agency, trying to assert independence and capacity and power. And I think this is what Israel's been doing since October. And of course, Israel has great military power and they've killed many thousands of Palestinians. But at the end of the day, this is not going to bring back a sense of security. It's not going to bring back certainly a sense of safety, no matter how much military force Israel uses, just as no matter how much military force the Palestinians may use. All the terrorist acts of the 1970s and the 1980s accomplished very little. And the events of October 7th, I mean, I'd like to think that out of this something good could come, but it's not really about honor and dignity for Israel. It's about assuring Israel's security. It's about assuring recognition for Israel on Erkenum, something that Israel continues to crave. I appreciate very much the Palestinian ongoing aspiration for dignity and respect precisely because of their position. But I think Israel's in a different position. It's in a contradictory position of being a powerful state that still remains largely unrecognized, at least unrecognized by the people whose recognition Israel requires most, and that is that of the Palestinians. So you talk about the master-slave, the master wants recognition from the slave. The master is afraid of the slave. But the master will only get that recognition when the slave is no longer a slave. And that is the dilemma moving forward. How Israel, given its political culture, it's very hard to imagine this happening, can move to a new political framework, a new political strategy in which it can accept Palestinians as equals granting them the dignity that they demand and deserve. But where Palestinians can truly, and not merely instrumentally, or for want of anything better, or want of any other choice, can say to Israel, we accept you. Because the language of Israel as an excrescence, as a settler colonial implant in the Middle East, is something that should never have been created and has no right to be there. That language is so dominant and becoming more dominant all the time. So again, what Israel requires is not dignity, honor, it needs recognition. But I think for peace to be made between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel's going to have to recognize Palestinians as people possessed of dignity. So I see a slightly different emotional balance there, or balance of the sensibilities between the two peoples if there is going to be a peaceful resolution.
Thank you, Professor Penslar. So Professor Bamyeh, and we'll try to open the room to the questions at -20. So a couple of minutes for your answer, if you want.
I think actually well, obviously, I agree that this conflict cannot be resolved by force, and that has been tried as well. And also, the political solutions have not worked either, and that largely because we have really very unequal conditions. I mean, we have one party that is so strong that it has no incentive to provide the absolute minimum that the weaker party can live with. And the weaker party have so little power that it cannot get the minimum that it can get. So in situations like that, you need a third factor, at least at the political level, that's some other kind of force, but to come into the equation and change kind of this kind of unequal balance of power. Otherwise, you won't get anywhere. But really, even more important than that are what I regard to be questions of Anerkennung, the idea of recognition of equality, that basically of the complete equality, ultimately, right? And the Palestinian independence, if it happens, not as a gift provided by a colonizer, basically to colonize, but actually as a right, something that is kind of undiminished. In the final analysis, I think the role of dignity basically in this struggle or conflict basically is related to the fact that dignity is a claim to justice. And justice and dignity basically are, in my mind, are inseparable, at least in this equation. And of course, if we are going to have peace, and at last, it has to be peace with justice, not just peace, ultimately, right? It has to be actually that ingredient that we have the restoration of justice at the end of story, meaning the restoration of dignity with it automatically. I think that's now that means many things. It means, for example, an admission of guilt on any party that has committed something wrong, including causing the refugee crisis. The problem with Oslo and all other kind of negotiations that have been attempted is that they have completely ignored this question, that it is really, we'll just agree on borders and this and that and settlements and what have you. But no one needs to actually admit any guilt about anything, ultimately. And I think even though we said that this is not a truth and reconciliation process, fine for now, but at the final analysis, actually, it has to be. That has to be kind of part of the solution, because I think ultimately a lasting solution of this conflict requires, in the final analysis, an agreement on the narrative, basically, of the conflict. And right now, we don't really have a common narrative. We have at least two, very distinct narratives that are very far apart from each other, so to speak. And even if we have kind of a peace agreement at this level, at the political level, that does not address basically the question of a common narrative, that will still be an uncertain kind of piece, a shaky piece, because it does not really deal with the root issue as to why most Arabs rejects the state of Israel. Right? Today, more than ever, right? Even though the Arab governments do not actually have that much of problem with Israel, basically, or as much as their population. But ultimately, as we know from the peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, you have peace treaties, but the population of those countries, for the most part, are not okay. They are not actually, they have not normalized that kind of relationship, and they are not going to normalize it, and especially now they are not. Not only that, but I continue to work with the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, and we still actually work with students throughout the region. And I am aware of the incredible radicalization that this war is creating, right, among especially the youth population everywhere in the region. And we work with students from across the region. So I'm kind of, we're far away, basically, precisely because of this war, but also because the conflict is far from being resolved. I'm worried about what we're going to see, say, 10 years from now, when this generation comes of age, and what they're going to do. So a peace in the long run basically has to be not just agreements among governments, but also kind of a process that lays down the ground for the population of the region, that to actually be able to live with what they regard to be a Western implant, that until today, right? And that is basically the way it continues to be recognized, not just by the Palestinians, but by most Arabs, ultimately, that is. And that basically requires basically a recognition of the right to dignity, that recognition of suffering, a recognition of guilt, that and a process toward creating a common narrative, ultimately, of this conflict. Right? And the common narrative, essentially, I think, will by itself, if it is common and believed in, kind of create conditions that everyone feels dignified and secure, that ultimately, because the problem of security and insecurity basically is not going to be resolved by having a huge military. Obviously, that has not worked. You have a huge military, very powerful, etc., but no feeling of security. And also, it is a one-sided view, ultimately, this question of security, because ultimately, why do we never talk about the security of the Palestinians? I mean, the Palestinians do not have any security, all of them. That's it. Yet the only kind of part of this equation that we hear about their insecurity is Israeli kind of obsession with security. So on the one hand, you have a situation right now where there is no recognition of dignity or otherwise. But on the other hand, we have, on the one side, a population, the Palestinians, that actually has for years lived without any security at all, right? Including in the Palestinian territories where the Israeli army can walk in any day and arrest anybody they want. On the other hand, on the other side of the wall, as well as in the settlements, you have a settler population that is obsessed with security, in spite of all the power that it has. Of course, all that is because ultimately we have a situation where kind of the dignity of the people, their daily concerns, their insecurity, basically, which is real, basically, is not recognized. And they're not being recognized as being worthy of security. Just as the Israelis insist that they should be recognized as worthy of security, worthy of more security than anybody else.
So thank you very much, Professor Bamyeh. Thank you very much, Professor Penslar. So now we're going, and thank you very much for answering these questions and for this discussion. Now we're opening the room to the questions of the audience. Since we only have 15 minutes, I'm going to ask several questions, and whoever wants to respond on what can decide freely. So the first question has been asked by our esteemed member, Bernard. It's a long question. So he's saying several attempts have been made to create an overarching narrative reconciling Israeli and Palestinian perspectives. He's quoting Sana Hassan, Amos Flon, Paul Sham, Sari Nusseibeh, amongst others. Those who subscribe to this approach insist on rooting it in liberal and universal values. They inevitably reach the conclusion that this conflict is at various levels a clash of rights. But can one make the case that behind this liberal veneer, the real purpose of this approach is to respect the honor of both parties? So this is question number one. I'm continuing question number two. The person is saying, I'm hearing so much empathy from Mr. Penslar and Mr. Bamyeh towards Israelis and Palestinians, but I would like to know what they think would trigger empathy towards each other, as I'm seeing this Palestinian empowerment can only trigger Israeli shame and desire to embarrass and vice versa. And maybe we can stop here with the first two questions and then we'll continue afterwards. And whoever wants to respond, feel free to do so.
I just made a few say word about the kind of attempts to create a common narrative. Actually, I think they are laudable attempts. I think but I wasn't talking about common narrative as intellectual projects, but as a kind of a part of a peace process. I'm sorry to use this term because it has been actually so. Lacks credibility at this point, given what we know about the history of peace processes, but kind of a process where a kind of a common narrative emerged organically out. A project of peace, basically, around which kind of a large number of people can kind of agree and not just kind of remain kind of held in among or the produced in intellectual circles, ultimately. And I think that common narrative, if we ever arrive at it, it has the advantage of replacing the sources of anxiety and insecurity that we have in the culture. For example, the question of trauma that Professor Penslar talked about and why it's still there, because it is the narrative that we have, right? And it is the narrative that is foundational for the state of Israel, and people do not actually abandon the foundational narrative until they have an alternative, compelling alternative. And that is really the kind of the idea behind kind of the common narrative, is that it would be the alternative to the narratives that we have right now. And those narratives that we have right now are the narratives that are producing war, suffering, and conflict. Right? And they exist because the alternative is not obvious to them. So the importance of this idea of a common narrative, I think, comes from the need to produce some kind of a framework of thinking that goes beyond basically the kind of the frozen kind of way of talking about our identity, their identity, basically that are not actually moving at all.
Just to tackle the second question about empathy, I think Sarah Ahmed wrote in her book on affect that we really can't empathize with people who have suffered in some distinct way, and the claim that we empathize with them usually can be seen as offensive and rings false. The best thing we can say is, I do not understand, I cannot empathize with what you've been going through. I sympathize in the sense that I understand that you've been going through something terrible, but I can't really understand it. I can't really plumb it and engage with it. It's too much to expect Israeli Jews right now, 90% of whom think that Israel is either using just enough military force or not enough military force, and Palestinians who are battered and not inclined to think well of Israel at the moment. It's really too much to expect empathy from them towards each other. And the problem is, and this is where, in my limited understanding of international relations, the Israel-Palestine conflict is so unique. Usually, after people have been killing each other for some time, they get to a point where they're sick of it. they reach what political scientists call a mutually hurting stalemate, and they actually want some kind of external intervention because they're ripe. I mean, ripeness is an international relations term. They're ripe for conflict resolution. We don't see it here. So the empathy can come from outsiders. It can come from Professor Bamyeh and myself. It can come from well-meaning people outside of Israel-Palestine, and maybe from some truly remarkable people within Israel-Palestine. But ultimately, it's not empathy that's going to make peace. It's going to be statecraft. And in this sense, I am maybe an old-fashioned capital R realist. It's going to be statecraft. It's going to be the work of leaders who do not merely reflect public opinion, but actually rise above it and mold it. And this is something that Dalia Scheindlin, who's a very good Israel correspondent, wrote about a couple of weeks ago. Great leaders can actually change public opinion. Where those leaders are going to come from, I don't know. As a historian, I have a hard enough time figuring out what happened. But what I do know is that if there's going to be a solution, it is going to come from the top down. Because ultimately, political history, military history, the history of conflict is, whether good or bad, it is shaped from the top down.
Can I pipe in and say a word about foundational myths, picking up what Professor Bamyeh said?
Sir, I'm sorry. Like, we have a lot of questions already in the Q&A. So if you have a question, can you please write it down so we can try to give everybody an equal shot. So we have two specific questions. One is for each. So I'm going to ask them at the same time, and then I'll try to give a quick answer, please. So the first one is for Professor Bamyeh. The person, first of all, says Ramadan Mubarak. You said that the October 7 attacks were not part of a larger strategy. So this person is saying, I have the impression that they were highly strategic, carried out with great brutality and on a very joyful Jewish holiday. They were designed to inflict maximum trauma. As you said, Hamas surely knew that there would be massive retaliation by Israel, but surely they also knew that the resulting Palestinian loss of life would make Israel look horrible in the eyes of the world. In addition, it seems that Hamas was much better prepared for self-defense than Israel had expected. The person is asking, am I mistaken in seeing a smart and effective strategy at work? And I'm going to ask the question that is directed at Professor Penslar right now. For Professor Penslar, you spoke about a decline of references to honor, kavod, in Israeli society, but a persistence of shame over the Holocaust with the events of October 7 reopening the wound. Question: honor also carries with it an idea of honorable, quote-unquote, behavior. Does the ferocity of the Israeli reaction to October 7 reflect an absence of norms of honorable conduct in a society motivated by an emotional reaction to humiliation? And 2-3 minutes for each answer, please. Yeah, whoever wants to go first.
Let me just briefly talk about Hamas and October 7. There are some analyses. Khalid al-Farouk from Northwestern Qatar comes to mind, who kind of seem to think that the Hamas attack succeeded beyond what Hamas wanted to do, actually. That the Hamas actually set out to do a more limited operation in October 7th. And things just got out of hand for various reasons. Could be because some other elements not tied to Hamas actually just came in, right, and did their thing as well, right? Or that kind of Hamas had actually two different sets of orders. So that needs to be clarified, actually, the details of what really happened on that day, actually, and whether Hamas actually wanted to do that attack that ended up happening, so to speak. But the fundamental fact is that the attack happened, right, at a point in time when it did not need to happen, strategically speaking. Actually, that is, I mean, you are in control of Gaza. you have, which has been the case for 17 some years. Gaza was under siege also for the same period of time. That had not changed either, to speak. So it is, so October 7th could have come and gone without an attack as another day, to speak. There was actually nothing strategically important to actually do. There's no specific strategy to call for that attack. The fact that Israel kind of reacted with full force and destroyed Gaza and killed 30,000 Palestinians and is still at it, so to speak, is not necessarily something that was predicted with that ferocity. I mean, obviously, it is difficult to actually explain the plan by what happened afterwards, because I don't think it is necessarily foreseen, at least in the details. Hamas was prepared because it has been living under siege for 17 years. So this is not new, actually, that it was fully prepared. It was also built itself as a solid organization internally as well, so to speak. So it is, and within, basically within the organization, there's accountability mechanism as well that you don't actually see in other organizations as well. So what happened, basically, let's speak. But if you look at it at a grand strategic kind of force, it is, the details of it is unclear. It was never actually taken for granted that, for example, that the world would see Israel as the aggressor in this case. In fact, until today, there are certain countries that still don't see Israel as the aggressor in this case. So that's not, I don't think that the kind of the dynamics, all the dynamics basically that we're dealing with would have been foreseen from the point of view of October 7th. But the one thing about October 7th is that at that point, one thing that is evident is that Hamas actually had nothing to lose. Ultimately. Similar to the situation that the Palestinians found themselves in after 1967, similar to the situation that Palestinians found themselves with the first Intifada, and so on. That is, you have a situation where populations or organizations basically find themselves in a situation where they have nothing to lose. And it is really at that point that they actually do something dramatic to bring attention to their cause. And that is actually how I see it. I don't see it in terms of a realistic plan, but in terms of as part of a historical pattern of rising up at the point when you have nothing to lose.
There is like I mentioned earlier, such a qualitative as well as quantitative difference between October 7th and previous, let's say, Palestinian attacks on Israel, that it's not surprising, perhaps, that in Israel, what had been sort of pre-existing doctrines about how one responds to a terrorist attack changed. The overwhelming sense in Israel is that October 7th changed the rules. And for example, the IDF has changed its doctrines about collateral damage. In other words, the amount of collateral damage that they're willing to inflict has grown massively. But this is defined in terms of military necessity because the gravity of the threat appears to have grown exponentially. And it's really interesting now how in Israel, I mean, people who, middle of the road, moderate people, or people who would describe themselves as moderate, see this war, and I'm simply explaining how they perceive it. They perceive it as deeply regrettable, but completely necessary. Because in their view, if Palestinians, civilians, support Hamas, then they're guilty by association. If they don't support Hamas, the fact that Hamas has embedded themselves in the population means that vast amounts of the Gaza population infrastructure have to be destroyed. I mean, for a lot of Israelis, this is something that is deeply unfortunate. And it reminds one of what Golda Meir allegedly said to Anwar Sadat, where she said, "We will never forgive you for forcing us to kill your children." I'm simply saying what is a common view in Israel now. Now, there are, interestingly, there are more and more Jews outside of Israel who are deeply uncomfortable with Israel's actions in the last few months. There are more and more cracks in the American or North American Jewish establishment, although the mainstream Jewish organizations remain completely aligned with Israel. But I would say, yes, the norms of military behavior in Israel changed radically after October 7th. And they changed because of the perception that Hamas's attack had changed qualitatively. And so the Israelis responded, what they believe at least, is in an appropriate way.
Thank you, professors. We still have a lot of questions, but now we're over the allotted time. So I want to reassure all of the people who are present that we're still going to have many meetings like this until June. The next one will be on the question, the role of comparisons in making sense of the conflict, comparisons with World War II, Nazism, with colonialism. This will be taking place at the end of the month. So anybody who might be interested can send us an email. Before parting ways, I really want to send a huge thank you to our two guests for their patience, for their interesting presentations, and also a huge thank you to the people who have been there. Maybe the two of you can give us some last words before we part ways. Professor Bamyeh, if you want.
Well, I think actually this has to continue. This is really important to actually remind people of the history, not just the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, basically, as we discuss the current conditions and future possibilities, but also the histories of intercommunal life in the larger region that we call the Middle East today, ultimately. Because one of the things that really, the larger context for me, at least, is the state system in the Middle East, which I don't think really functions very well. And that's not only that, but in a way that before the Mara state, actually, we did have thriving Jewish communities throughout the region, in Baghdad, in Alexandria, in North Africa, in Damascus, everywhere. So, and Jewish population were part of the normal fabric of the region as a whole. All that has been disrupted, not just by the creation of the State of Israel, but also by the creation of modern states in general, that also have not been kind to their own populations, ultimately. So I think when we think about kind of the larger parameters of this conflict, its history, the present condition, and future prospects, we also have, I think, to think about emancipatory potential that all populations of the region kind of can be called upon to share in common. And this has to come from below. I do agree that basically solutions tend to come from the makers of politics. But I think we have enough history to not rely on them too much, to learn that they're not necessarily helpful people. But a lot of the change that is necessary and that has perhaps happened before in other parts of the world, that kind of came from below, from civil society groups, from social movements that organized from below, that changed reality. And the Palestinian struggle basically essentially is a history from below kind of a struggle. Right? It is not a state against other state, but rather a population that managed to organize itself over decades, basically in various forms, and keep itself present, basically. And it's a social movement. It's not government, and it is, and the contestation of other regions, other regimes in the region as well, are coming from below by social movements. Because ultimately, I think the politicians we have are incapable of solving the problem we are facing, including democratically elected rulers. They are unhelpful.
If I can go meta for a moment, I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to talk with you, Professor Bamyeh. You know, we have somewhat different points of view, but we also overlap. And just to be able to have a civil conversation, Harvard, as you may have read, is having a few issues these days, as are most universities. And we've been doing a lot to try to promote conversations like this one. And if we'd had the time, and if things could have gone on a bit longer, we would have taken more questions, and the questions might have become, you know, much more pointed. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if people, and this is where, you know, I think social movements have their value, but I think that screaming and threatening and intimidating and harassing and abusing doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. And I know when I've taught on the Vietnam War, there's a myth that student movements brought an end to the war in Vietnam, which is simply not true. What brought an end to the war in Vietnam was lots of Americans being killed and ordinary, normal, non-college student Americans getting sick of the whole thing. And yes, they made their opinions clear, and, you know, Richard Nixon realized it was time to pull the plug. Conversations can be had that don't involve, I think, threats and calls to violence and calls to destruction. I just don't see how that can possibly accomplish any good whatsoever. And we can have conversations. They don't have to be quite as polite as this one. They could be a little bit more, you know, a little bit more pointed. But I see what's going on in the universities throughout North America, and I just see that, you know, if we really do believe that social movements can make a difference, then let's work together. And I see that there's representatives of Omdim Biachad are standing together here. So let's work together in constructively minded organizations of that type. And don't want to give too much of a plug for the anti-Semitism task force or the anti-Islamic, anti-Arab bias task force at Harvard, but I'm very much hoping that all of us can work together to promote a much healthier atmosphere on campuses throughout North America.
Bezrat Hashem, inshallah. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure having all of you here, and we welcome you for our next presentation, which will be, as I said, at the end of the month. Keep in tune. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.